Hey there, you looking kinda cute. Don't forget to subscribe and check out my other socials for more. Enjoy. As consciousness crept in, so did the familiar sense of unease. Scott sat up, running fingers through disheveled hair, and gazed at the reflection in the mirror across the room. The image staring back felt like a stranger. Broad shoulders, stubbled jaw, muscular arms. Everything about it felt wrong, like wearing a suit that didn't quite fit. Scott sighed heavily, shoulders slumping. Another day of pretending, of forcing himself into a mold that felt increasingly suffocating. He stood, stretching muscles that ached from a restless night, and made his way to the closet. Rifling through hangers of drab button-downs and slacks, Scott's hand lingered on a softer fabric hidden in the back. He pulled out a pale pink sweater, running his fingers over the delicate knit. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine wearing it, how the color would complement his skin, how the soft material would drape over his frame. The fantasy was shattered by a sharp knock at the door. "Scott, are you up? Breakfast is ready." His mother's voice, laden with false cheer, filtered through the wood. Hastily, Scott shoved the sweater back into its hiding place. "Be right down," he called, voice gruff with sleep and disappointment. He grabbed a plain gray t-shirt and jeans, quickly dressing before heading downstairs. In the kitchen, his parents were already seated at the table. His father barely glanced up from his newspaper, while his mother's smile was brittle as she set a plate of eggs and bacon in front of him. "Good morning, sweetie," she chirped. "I laid out that nice blue shirt for your interview later. You always look so handsome in it." Scott's stomach clenched. The interview, another attempt by his parents to steer him towards a respectable career. He forced a smile. "Thanks, Mom." As he mechanically ate his breakfast, his mother prattled on about the law firm where he'd be interviewing, emphasizing how impressed they'd be with such a fine young man. Each word felt like a tiny dagger, chipping away at the facade Scott struggled to maintain. His father finally lowered the newspaper, fixing Scott with a stern gaze. "Remember, son, first impressions are everything. Stand up straight, firm handshake. Show them you're a man who knows what he wants." Scott nodded, not trusting himself to speak. If only they knew how far from the truth that was. He didn't know what he wanted, or rather, he knew, but it was so far removed from their expectations that he couldn't bring himself to voice it. After breakfast, Scott retreated to his room to change. He stared at the blue shirt laid out on his bed, feeling a wave of revulsion. It represented everything he was trying to escape, the suffocating expectations, the constant pressure to be someone he wasn't. With trembling hands, he reached for the pink sweater once more. For a moment, he held it against his chest, imagining a different life where he could wear it without fear or shame. Then, with a heavy sigh, he returned it to its hiding place and donned the blue shirt. As he knotted his tie, Scott caught his reflection in the mirror. The person staring back was a stranger, polished, professional, utterly masculine. He closed his eyes, trying to quell the rising panic in his chest. "This isn't me," he whispered to the empty room. "This isn't who I am." But who was he really? The question had haunted Scott for as long as he could remember. From childhood, he'd felt a disconnect between his body and his sense of self. While other boys roughhoused and played sports, Scott had been drawn to softer pursuits, art, music, fashion. He'd tried to hide it, to fit in, but the feeling of wrongness only grew stronger with time. Now, at 25, the pressure to conform was reaching a breaking point. His parents' well-meaning attempts to shape him into their idea of a successful man felt like a noose tightening around his neck. Every son and young man was a reminder of the gulf between their perception and his reality. Scott took a deep breath, smoothing down his shirt one last time. He could do this. He could play the part, go through the motions. But a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that he couldn't keep up the charade forever. The interview was a blur of forced smiles and rehearsed answers. Scott felt like a puppet, strings pulled by unseen hands as he went through the motions. The partners seemed impressed, commenting on his firm handshake and confident demeanor. If only they could see the turmoil beneath the surface. As he left the law firm, Scott felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The facade slipped away, leaving him feeling raw and exposed. He loosened his tie, gasping for air that suddenly felt too thin. Without conscious thought, his feet carried him to a small park nearby. He collapsed onto a bench, head in his hands. The carefully constructed walls he'd built around himself were crumbling, and he didn't know how to stop it. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves overhead, carrying with it the scent of flowers in bloom. Scott looked up, taking in the vibrant colors of the garden around him. How long had it been since he'd allowed himself to simply appreciate beauty? As he sat there, surrounded by nature's soft curves and delicate hues, Scott felt a sense of calm settle over him. This was what felt right, not the harsh lines and muted tones of the corporate world he'd been pushed towards. A group of women passed by, their laughter carrying on the wind. Scott found himself studying their outfits, the way they moved with easy grace. He imagined himself among them, not as an outsider, but as one of them. The longing was so intense it was almost physical pain. "I can't keep doing this," Scott whispered to himself. The realization hit him with startling clarity. He couldn't continue living a lie, suffocating the true self that was desperately trying to emerge. With shaking hands, Scott pulled out his phone. He scrolled through his contacts, pausing on a name he hadn't called in years. Taking a deep breath, he pressed the call button. "Hello?" A familiar voice answered, warm and slightly confused. "Aunt Sarah," Scott's voice cracked. I need to talk to you about everything." Hours later, Scott sat in his aunt's cozy living room, a cup of tea cooling on the table in front of him. Sarah listened patiently as years of pent-up feelings and fears poured out of him. She didn't interrupt, didn't judge. She simply held space for his truth. When Scott finally fell silent, emotionally exhausted, Sarah reached out and took his hand. "Thank you for trusting me with this," she said softly. "I always knew there was something you were holding back. I'm so proud of you for having the courage to speak your truth." Tears spilled down Scott's cheeks. For the first time in his life, he felt truly seen and accepted. Sarah pulled him into a tight hug, stroking his hair as he sobbed. "What do I do now?" Scott asked when he could finally speak again. "My parents, they'll never understand." Sarah's eyes were filled with compassion. "It won't be easy," she admitted, "but you deserve to live authentically, to be true to yourself. I'll be here to support you every step of the way." They spent the rest of the evening talking through Scott's fears and hopes. Sarah helped him research support groups and therapists specializing in gender identity. For the first time, Scott allowed himself to imagine a future where he could truly be himself. As he prepared to leave, Sarah disappeared into her bedroom. She returned with a small gift bag, which she pressed into Scott's hands. "I've been holding on to this for a while," she said with a smile. "I think now is the right time." Scott opened the bag to find a delicate silver necklace with a butterfly pendant. Fresh tears welled in his eyes as he ran his fingers over the intricate design. "Butterflies represent transformation," Sarah explained softly. "They remind us that change, while sometimes difficult, can lead to something beautiful." Scott clutched the necklace to his chest, overwhelmed with emotion. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." As he drove home, the weight of his secret felt lighter. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of self-discovery and small acts of rebellion. Scott began seeing a therapist who specialized in gender identity issues, finally giving voice to feelings he'd suppressed for so long. In those sessions, he allowed himself to explore the possibility of transitioning, of aligning his outer appearance with his inner truth. At home, he found subtle ways to express his femininity. He grew out his hair, explaining it away as a new style trend. He experimented with clear nail polish, reveling in the secret shimmer only he could see. The butterfly necklace from his aunt became a constant companion, hidden beneath his shirts, but a comforting presence against his skin. His mother noticed the changes, her brow furrowing with concern. "You're not still hanging out with those artsy types from college, are you?" she asked one evening, eyeing his longer hair with disapproval. "I thought you'd grown out of that phase." Scott forced a laugh, tamping down the hurt her words caused. "It's just hair, Mom. It's not a big deal." But it was a big deal. Each small act of self-expression felt like reclaiming a piece of himself he'd locked away for far too long. The true turning point came on a crisp autumn day as Scott prepared for his cousin's wedding. He stood in front of his closet, staring at the suit his mother had picked out. The thought of wearing it, of playing the role of the perfect son one more time, made him feel physically ill. With trembling hands, he reached for the back of his closet, pulling out a garment bag he'd hidden there weeks ago. Inside was a flowing maxi dress in a soft lavender shade. He'd ordered it online, heart pounding as he clicked purchase, and had it delivered to his aunt's house for safekeeping. Scott slipped on the dress, the silk cool against his skin. He turned to face the mirror, breath catching in his throat. For the first time, the reflection staring back at him felt right. The dress skimmed over his body. Tears welled in his eyes as he twirled, watching the fabric billow around him. This was who he was meant to be. This was the person he'd been hiding for so long. A knock at the door jolted him from his reverie. "Scott, are you ready? We need to leave soon." His mother's voice was sharp with impatience. Panic gripped him. He wasn't ready for this confrontation, wasn't prepared to face the inevitable fallout. But as he looked at his reflection once more, he knew he couldn't go back. He couldn't keep hiding. With shaking hands, he opened the door. His mother's eyes widened in shock, her mouth falling open. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. What is this?" she finally managed, voice barely above a whisper. Scott took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. "This is me, Mom. The real me. The person I've always been, even if I was too afraid to show it." His mother's face cycled through a range of emotions: confusion, anger, fear. "Is this some kind of joke? You can't wear that to the wedding. What will people think?" "I don't care what people think," Scott replied, surprised by the steadiness in his voice. "I care about being true to myself. I'm tired of pretending to be someone I'm not." "But you're my son," his mother protested, tears filling her eyes. "My little boy." Scott's heart ached at the pain in her voice, but he stood his ground. "I'm still your child," he said gently, "but I'm not your son. I never have been. Not really. I'm your daughter." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with years of unspoken truth. His mother stumbled backward, shaking her head in denial. "No," she whispered. "No, this isn't happening." She turned and fled down the hallway, leaving Scott standing alone in the doorway. He could hear her muffled sobs from the living room, mixed with his father's confused questions. Scott's hands clenched into fists at his sides, nails digging into his palms. He'd known this wouldn't be easy, but the reality of it was more painful than he'd imagined. Part of him wanted to change back into the suit, to pretend this had never happened. But a stronger part, the part that had been silenced for far too long, refused to back down. He made his way downstairs, each step feeling like it took monumental effort. His parents were huddled together on the couch, his mother weeping into his father's shoulder. They looked up as he entered, his father's face a mask of confusion and betrayal. "What's going on?" his father demanded. "What have you done to upset your mother?" Scott took a deep breath, gathering his courage. "I'm transgender," he said, voice stronger than he felt. "I've known for a long time, but I've been too afraid to say it. I can't keep living a lie. I need to be true to who I really am." His father's face hardened. "This is ridiculous. "You're confused. It's probably just stress from work or—" "It's not confusion," Scott interrupted. "It's who I am, who I've always been. I'm not asking for your permission. I'm telling you who I am." The silence that followed was deafening. Scott could see the struggle playing out on his parents' faces, the desire to understand warring with deeply ingrained beliefs and expectations. Finally, his father spoke, voice low and controlled. "I think you should leave. We need time to process this." The words hit Scott like a physical blow, but he nodded. He'd known this was a possibility, had prepared himself for rejection. It still hurt more than he could have imagined. "Okay," he said softly. "I'll go. But please, try to understand. I'm still the same person you've always known. I'm just finally being honest about who that person is." His mother let out a choked sob, burying her face in her hands. His father wouldn't meet his eyes. Scott turned and walked out the front door, each step feeling like he was leaving a piece of himself behind. As he drove away from his childhood home, tears blurring his vision, Scott felt a mix of grief and liberation. He mourned the relationship with his parents, the easy acceptance he'd always craved but never truly had. But beneath the pain was a sense of freedom, of finally stepping into his true self after years of hiding. He drove to his aunt's house, knowing she would welcome him with open arms. As he pulled into her driveway, he caught sight of his reflection in the rearview mirror. Despite the tear-stained cheeks and red-rimmed eyes, he saw something he'd never seen before, the first glimpse of the woman he was meant to be. Scott took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. This was just the beginning of his journey, and he knew there would be more challenges ahead. But for the first time in his life, he felt ready to face them as his authentic self. As he stepped out of the car, the lavender dress swirling around his legs, Scott made a silent promise to himself. From this day forward, he would live his truth no matter how difficult it might be. He would become the person he was always meant to be. The months that followed were a whirlwind of change and self-discovery. Scott began hormone replacement therapy, watching with a mix of excitement and trepidation as his body slowly began to align with his true gender. He grew out his hair, experimenting with different styles and colors. Shopping for clothes became an adventure rather than a chore, as he explored styles and silhouettes he'd only dreamed of wearing before. Throughout it all, his Aunt Sarah remained a steadfast source of support. She accompanied him to doctor's appointments, helped him navigate the legal hurdles of changing his name and gender marker, and provided a shoulder to cry on during moments of doubt and fear. As Scott's outer appearance began to shift, so did his name. After much consideration, he chose to go by Ellis, a name that felt both familiar and new, a bridge between his past and his future. The first time someone called him Ellis and used female pronouns, he felt a surge of joy so intense it brought tears to his eyes. His parents remained distant, their silence a painful reminder of what he'd lost. Ellis sent them regular updates on his transition, hoping that with time and information they might come to understand and accept him. The responses, when they came, were terse and formal, lacking the warmth of their previous relationship. Despite the pain of this estrangement, Ellis found himself surrounded by a new kind of family. He connected with other transgender individuals through support groups and online communities, forging friendships based on shared experiences and mutual understanding. These connections became a lifeline, providing guidance and encouragement as he navigated the complexities of transition. Work presented its own set of challenges. Ellis had been fortunate to find a job at a small graphic design firm where his creativity was valued more than his appearance. Still, coming out to his colleagues was nerve-wracking. He prepared a carefully worded email explaining his transition and requesting that they use his new name and pronouns. The response was overwhelmingly positive. His co-workers rallied around him, offering support and making a concerted effort to respect his identity. There were occasional slip-ups and moments of awkwardness, but overall, Ellis felt accepted and valued for who he truly was. As the physical changes of hormone therapy became more pronounced, Ellis found himself navigating a world that suddenly viewed him very differently. He experienced the joys of being recognized as female by strangers, but also faced the harsh realities of occasionally transphobia. Each challenge, however, only strengthened his resolve to live authentically. 1 year into his transition, Ellis stood in front of his mirror, hardly recognizing the person staring back at him. Soft curves had replaced angular lines, and his face had taken on a more feminine appearance. But it was his eyes that had changed the most. They shone with a confidence and joy that had been absent for so long. He ran his fingers through his now shoulder-length hair, marveling at its softness. The butterfly necklace from his aunt glinted at his throat, a reminder of how far he'd come. Ellis smiled at his reflection, feeling truly at home in his body for the first time in his life. A notification on his phone pulled him from his reverie. It was an email from his mother, the first direct communication they'd had in months. With trembling fingers, Ellis opened the message. "Dear Ellis," it began, the use of his chosen name causing his breath to catch. "Your father and I have been doing a lot of thinking and a lot of learning. We realize now that we reacted poorly when you came out to us. Our shock and fear blinded us to the pain you must have been experiencing for so long. We're sorry for not being there for you when you needed us most. We can't pretend to fully understand everything you're going through, but we want to try. We miss you, and we want to be part of your life again if you'll let us. We know we have a lot of work to do to rebuild your trust, but we're willing to put in the effort. If you're open to it, we'd like to see you, to meet Ellis, our daughter, properly for the first time. We love you, and we're proud of the strong woman you've become. Love, Mom and Dad." Tears streamed down Ellis's face as he read and reread the email. It wasn't perfect, and he knew there would still be difficult conversations ahead. But it was a start, a bridge across the chasm that had formed between them. With shaking hands, he typed out a reply, agreeing to meet them for dinner the following weekend. As he hit send, Ellis felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He didn't know exactly what the future held, but for the first time in his life, he felt ready to face it as his true self. The day of the dinner arrived, bringing with it a storm of nervous energy. Ellis stood in front of his closet, agonizing over what to wear. He wanted to look nice, to show his parents the woman he'd become, but he also didn't want to overwhelm them. Finally, he settled on a simple floral sundress and low heels, accessorized with the butterfly necklace that had become his talisman. As he applied a light touch of makeup, Ellis tried to calm his racing heart. He reminded himself of how far he'd come, of the strength he'd discovered within himself. Whatever happened tonight, he would face it with grace and authenticity. The drive to the restaurant felt both interminable and far too short. As Ellis parked his car, he caught sight of his parents waiting near the entrance. For a moment, he allowed himself to simply observe them. They looked older, more careworn than he remembered. His mother was fidgeting with her purse strap, a nervous habit he recognized from childhood. His father stood ramrod straight, hands clasped behind his back, but Ellis could see the tension in his shoulders. Taking a deep breath, Ellis stepped out of the car. The click of his heels on the pavement seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet evening air. As he approached, his parents turned towards him, their eyes widening. For a long moment, no one spoke. Ellis could see the mix of emotions playing across his parents' faces. Shock, confusion, and something that looked like dawning recognition. His mother was the first to break the silence. "Ellis," she said, her voice quavering. "Is that really you?" Ellis nodded, not trusting himself to speak. To his surprise, his mother stepped forward and enveloped him in a tight hug. The familiar scent of her perfume brought a rush of memories, and Ellis found himself clinging to her, tears spilling down his cheeks. "Oh, sweetheart," his mother murmured, her own voice thick with emotion. "You look beautiful." Those simple words, so long yearned for, broke something open inside Ellis. He sobbed openly, years of pain and longing pouring out of him. His father joined the embrace, his strong arms encircling both Ellis and his mother. When they finally separated, all three were wiping away tears. Ellis's father cleared his throat, clearly struggling to find the right words. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice gruff with emotion. "I'm sorry we weren't there for you. I'm sorry it took us so long to see you. Really see you." Ellis nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He reached out and squeezed his father's hand, a gesture of forgiveness and understanding. The dinner that followed was a mix of awkward pauses and moments of surprising connection. His parents stumbled over pronouns occasionally, but Ellis could see they were genuinely trying. They asked questions about his transition, listening with rapt attention as he explained the changes he'd experienced. As the evening drew to a close, Ellis felt a sense of cautious hope. Things weren't perfect, and he knew there would still be challenges ahead. But this was a start, a foundation they could build upon. His mother hugged him tightly as they said goodbye. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. "You're so brave and so strong. I'm sorry it took me so long to see that." Ellis's father clasped his shoulder, his eyes suspiciously bright. "You'll always be our child," he said gruffly. "We love you, Ellis." As Ellis drove home that night, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. The road ahead might not be easy, but for the first time, he felt like he had the support he needed to face whatever challenges lay ahead. He caught sight of his reflection in the rearview mirror, the soft curve of his cheek, the shimmer of his earrings, the confident set of his shoulders. Ellis smiled, truly smiled, feeling the joy of being seen and accepted for who he really was. The butterfly necklace glinted in the streetlights, a reminder of the beautiful transformation he'd undergone. Ellis touched it gently, silently, thanking all those who had supported him on this journey. His aunt, his friends, and now, finally, his parents. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to check out my other socials if you want more wonderful content, early access, behind the scenes, and more. All links down below.